But even in the middle of the worst fighting, there are moments when guns fall silent, missiles stop flying, and enemies pause. These moments are called ceasefires. A ceasefire is an agreement between opposing sides to stop fighting. Sometimes it's just for a few hours. Sometimes it stretches into weeks, months, even years. But what's important is this: it doesn't mean the war is over. It's a pause, a fragile one. So how do ceasefires work and what happens when they fall apart? Let's start with the basics. Ceasefires can be formal or informal. Some are written down, signed, and monitored by international observers. Others are simply announced over the airwaves or agreed upon through back channels. In some cases, one side declares a unilateral ceasefire. They stop shooting, hoping the other side will follow. Other times, both sides agree at once. And when more than two groups are involved, things get even more complicated. Why would enemies stop fighting, even temporarily? There are a few reasons. Sometimes it's about politics. Outside pressure from the United Nations, regional leaders, or powerful allies can push both sides to agree to stop. Other times, it's for humanitarian reasons. Civilians need to evacuate. Food and medicine need to get through. Aid workers need safe access. A ceasefire can make that possible. And sometimes both sides are just exhausted. A pause gives them space to regroup, rearm, or even talk peace. But the truth is, ceasefires are risky. They rely on trust, or at least on mutual interest. And that brings us to the heart of the problem. What happens when one side breaks the deal? Let's look at some real-world examples to see how this plays out. In May 2021, fighting erupted between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. For 11 days, the conflict escalated rapidly, with rocket fire and airstrikes. Eventually, after heavy casualties and international pressure, both sides agreed to a ceasefire, brokered by Egypt. For the moment, the fighting stopped. But tensions remained high, and violence flared up again months later. That ceasefire, like many before it, held just long enough to cool things down, but not long enough to create lasting peace. Now, jump back to 1953. The Korean War was devastating. But instead of ending in a peace treaty, it stopped with a ceasefire, technically called an armistice. That agreement created the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, and put the war on pause. North and South Korea are still, officially, at war. But that ceasefire has held more or less for over 70 years. It's one of the rare cases where a ceasefire froze a conflict in place. Not every attempt is that successful. In eastern Ukraine, from 2014 until early 2022, there were multiple ceasefires between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists. Some lasted days, others just hours. The most well-known effort, the Minsk agreements, included detailed ceasefire terms. But fighting continued, with both sides blaming each other for violations. Eventually, Russia launched a full-scale invasion, shattering the entire framework. The broken ceasefires in Donbass became a warning of what was to come. And then there's Syria. The civil war there saw multiple ceasefires brokered by different countries and international bodies. In 2016, for example, a temporary ceasefire allowed civilians to flee from Aleppo before government forces took control. It only lasted a few days, but those few days meant survival for many. That's the thing with ceasefires. Even short ones can save lives. But what exactly happens when a ceasefire is broken? First, violence usually returns fast and harder. It's not a slow ramp-up. One side attacks, the other retaliates, and within hours, full-scale fighting resumes. That's what happened in 2020 in Nagorno-Karabakh, when ceasefire agreements between Armenia and Azerbaijan fell apart repeatedly. Each time, the war resumed with more intensity. Second, broken ceasefires destroy trust. If one side breaks the deal, it's hard to convince the other to try again. Peace negotiations stall. Future offers are dismissed. Leaders may be unwilling to risk looking weak. And without trust, diplomacy dies. Third, civilians often pay the highest price. Ceasefires usually create small windows for aid deliveries, evacuations, or medical care. When those windows slam shut, people get trapped. Bombs fall again, and the fragile lifeline of humanitarian relief is cut off. Fourth, there are political consequences. A side that breaks a ceasefire can lose international support. It may face sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or even legal consequences in the eyes of the international community. That's part of what happened to Russia in the lead-up to the 2022 invasion. Accusations of repeated ceasefire violations in Ukraine damaged its credibility on the world stage. So do ceasefires ever really work? The answer is, sometimes. In Northern Ireland, for example, a ceasefire in the 1990s led to the Good Friday Agreement, which brought an end to decades of violence known as the Troubles. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. In Colombia, a ceasefire between the government and the FARC rebels eventually led to a peace deal. These are the exceptions, but they show what's possible. More often, ceasefires are messy, fragile, broken again and again. But even in those cases, they can buy time. They can give civilians a chance to breathe. They can open doors to peace, even if just for a while. The bottom line is this: ceasefires are not peace, but they are part of the road that leads to it. They're a tool, a risk, a signal of hope, or sometimes a signal of desperation. So the next time you hear that a ceasefire has been announced, remember, it's not the end of the war, but it might be the beginning of something better. Thanks for listening. If you found this breakdown helpful, please consider subscribing for more content like this. And in the comments, let us know, what's a ceasefire in history that you think made the biggest difference? Until next time, take care.